Road Signs. Chapter 10. Doomsday Elves. But I am not a wolf by blood. Tuck me, like a hat, into the sleeve of the hot fur coat of the Siberian steppes. Ossip Mandelstam. The Wolfhound Century. Ah, you know, my Lasoshka. Maybe it is better. In the end, maybe it is better as it is. You cannot imagine what a nasty creature I am, a scoundrel, an idler, a carouser, a libertine, a chatterbox, a frivolous person, a stubborn glutton, a sly one, an argumentative person, a dreamer, a spiteful person, an eccentric, a windbag. You would be, my child, unhappy as stones, and you would take revenge on me. At the very thought of this, my hair stands on end on both sides of my forehead. Glory to the omniscient God. Everything is fine as it is. Romain Rolland. Cola Brugnon. We had passed Tver quite a while ago when it started snowing, and I saw the landscape changing color before my eyes. Then the air changed and became white. The nimble wipers behind the windshield quickly made gaps in it, and I thought about the benefits of reading. Snow was the strongest sensation in recent times. I would say that it caused such surprise in me that I had not experienced even from the sight of the sea, that is the Gulf of Finland. If I had not read about snow, then I would have panicked right now. For any normal person who has lived half his life underground, this was a very strange sight. Rain underground is quite common, especially when quicksand begins to ooze through holes in old tubing, and this fine drop unexpectedly douses you from head to toe. I did not remember snow in my childhood at all, but books talked about snow in detail, and therefore I was not afraid of this white whirlwind. I wasn't afraid, but in vain, because the very experienced Vladimir Pavlovich was very tense and started saying that the devil knows what to do if there are snowdrifts on the road. But, as it turned out, he didn't understand weather phenomena very well either. The next day the snow melted completely and turned into rain. It rained for another day, then another, and then real snow started falling. Big, large flakes fell on the glass, and the wipers, as luck would have it, broke. Suddenly, Vladimir Pavlovich's face turned white. Something was wrong. He felt something that I didn't feel. The mathematician also suddenly felt uneasy, and he fell like a sack onto the vibrating floor of the cabin. I rushed to Vladimir Pavlovich. "What is this? What is this?" I shook him by the shoulder. He turned his face to me with his eyes almost rolled back and exhaled. "This is a Helmholtz generator. I don't know where it came from or where it is, but it's a generator. Look, son, we can start jumping from here now. Hold us." He said the last words already falling to the floor. Meanwhile, the mathematician was already crawling towards the door, despite the fact that blood was flowing from his ears. I pulled the belt out of his pants and carefully tied the mathematician to the equipment stand. Then I did the same with Vladimir Pavlovich and took his place as the engineer. I heard something, some strange mumbling, maybe a whistling sound, and nothing more. I felt absolutely no discomfort. And, apparently, this was the price for my nightmares, and for the fact that I woke up in a sweat for 20 years. Our train was going past a completely ordinary area. Of course, I was taken in by surprise about the Helmholtz generator. But I knew what a Helmholtz generator was. Any vessel with a narrow neck was such a generator, or even our heads, especially with open mouths, were Helmholtz generators. The name was beautiful, but there was nothing scary about it. And there was nothing scary about the sound I heard. That was roughly how the pig farmers mumbled when they walked past their charges. One complained that his legs hurt, the second scolded his superiors, the third hummed under his breath. That's what this muttering was. But it had an amazing effect on the mathematician and Vladimir Pavlovich. Even tied up, they scraped their feet along the iron floor, raked their hands, as if they were floating in the air. At the same time, both were singing some amazing song. Probably, such songs were sung by the ancestors of the late Mirzo, when they rode their little donkeys through the mountains and talked to the universe through singing. What I see, I sing about, as the station master of Sokol once said, when he was hinted that we produced more canned pork than he had distributed in salaries. So I drove the train for several hours until I myself found myself in a difficult situation. I mistakenly drove the diesel locomotive onto a siding, and I did not understand how to switch the points back. I could not cope with this without Vladimir Pavlovich, but Vladimir Pavlovich was now incapacitated. My comrades were clearly not well. We stopped, and Vladimir Pavlovich and the mathematician fell out onto the track. They lay right on the snow and stupidly looked at the sky, and I decided that it was radiation. But no, the background was normal. In general, the background here was suspiciously often normal, and this could not help but be alarming. Or here, above, there were simply different rules of life and a different logic of danger than in the tunnels. Vladimir Pavlovich, by the way, said that I do not feel some radiation, precisely because there is something wrong in my head. That is why I have my dreams, after which I swim in a puddle of sweat. The body works a little differently, and then removes unnecessary chemicals with liquid. All these products of stress and tension. I do not know what the matter is. We passed the dangerous place without losses, and, as I now understand, in exact accordance with the road signs. Next to us stood a stick, on one side of which a white circle said, "End of the dangerous section," and on the other, on the contrary, "Beginning of the dangerous section." And this section remained behind us. Having caught his breath, Vladimir Pavlovich said, "I'm a gardener. I forgot. I knew all this. Timoshin told me in 10, but I didn't believe him." "Who is Timoshin?" "Yes, my classmate. He got into trouble in this place. He barely got out, and with losses. This is the famous Verabinskoye straightening, a cursed place. Why cursed? Because, what? A power outlet, space aliens. It's not clear what. The zone there, like Chernobyl, only before any cataclysm, before radiation. Some kind of forgotten experiment. Timoshin said that when you go into the forest, you always walk in circles. No one can reach the borders of this zone if you go from the inside. But on the outside, everything is as usual. You can't surprise a Soviet person with such things, rows of barbed wire, some old trucks. Everyone thought that it was because missile units had been stationed there a long time ago. So someone told Timoshin that a man walked through this forest, and when he came out to the edge, he saw there was an abandoned fire pit. And nearby on a birch tree, there was a radio. The music was playing, only a little strangely, as if a tape recorder was pulling a film. You don't remember, but there were such cassette and reel-to-reel tape recorders, and here on the birch tree there was a radio, an old Spidola, and it was playing. At the same time, it is known that no one had been to these places for 4 years. What kind of batteries? One wonders. Well, it wasn't about the batteries. What's the matter here? If the music is in slow rhythms, then it means that the wave is lagging, and already quite significantly. That is, time flows completely differently there. You step into it, like into a river, like into jelly. You can't lift your legs. The same Timoshin, already old, but he still remembered. The same Timoshin, already old, but still remembered that some trackman had told him that there was a completely different time next to the track, as if someone had splashed the past across the forest. There were two birch trees that he had long remembered. One was not growing at all, thin, and the second was already thick, rotten, and would soon collapse. Well, in such cases they used to say, and the dead with scythes stand along the road there. But I will tell you that there is nothing funny about this, Alexander Nikolaevich. Timoshin had not seen any walking dead there, but at the cemetery there after 1985. But then the mathematician, who had come to his senses, interrupted us. He smeared the blood, which had already stopped coming from his nose, across his face, and asked, "What was that?" No one answered him, and suddenly he guessed for himself. Virbi, straightening. Exactly so, Vladimir Pavlovich answered him. And you, Alexander, apparently have a negative reaction to acoustics, summed up the mathematician, in both, so to speak, senses. I don't know. So what was there? I asked again, without any hope of an answer. What's the matter? In what? In that? It's not for nothing that the Queen of the Night chose you. Flowers are generally sensitive to acoustic interactions. So tell me, what's the matter? What, do I have a hurricane mutation? You, Alexander, don't throw words around. Where are you? And where is the mutation? You might as well say that you have instantaneous delta changes. No, the whole point is that something is wrong with your physiology. That's why you went bald, by the way. Nothing just happens with us. Have there been similar cases? There have been. I won't tell you. You don't need that. Wait a minute, Alexander. It's still unknown what will happen to you. I had one colleague. He tried to raise matches with his gaze. He picked up 5 matches, and on the 6th, he strained himself. Forever, then. The mathematician told a story from his previous life for the first time. Somewhere a bear died, as the station master of Sokol would say. I was rather frightened by this new trustworthiness of the mathematician when the boss or the owner becomes a man. This does not mean anything good. He will lose his charisma and at some point make a wrong move for which you yourself will be responsible. And the mathematician became less and less of a boss to us, just a fellow traveler, to whom you could object when the opportunity arose. The snow kept falling, and soon it became impossible to drive. We stopped and collapsed into bed. The wind howled outside, but here, near the still warm cabinets with equipment, it was easy and fell easily and calmly, like an animal in a hole. I woke up from the amazing silence. It seemed that I could hear the movement of blood in my body. Or maybe I didn't. I looked out the window and saw that the tracks were covered with snow. Vladimir Pavlovich and I climbed outside to see what was there, and it turned out that there was no way to go either forward or backward. Raise the knife, close the wings, he muttered. What? There are such road signs when a snowplow is working. They are placed in front of an obstacle. It's called raise the knife, close the wings. I immediately imagined the wings extending on the sides of the locomotive and it taking off. I even had to shake my head to make this vision disappear. But the wings, as it soon became clear, would not have interfered with us. As we walked forward, along the snow-covered paths, I realized that the road was covered for several kilometers, and there was no end to the snowdrifts. Of course, we can grab a shovel and shovel snow until evening, talking to ourselves, Vladimir Pavlovich muttered, and then he objected to himself. Well, we'll wave for a month. We'll be completely exhausted, the frosts will start, and we'll stretch our legs along our entrenching tool. I didn't interfere with this muttering. It was clear that we were stuck fast, and it was obvious to me that there was no snowplow to be found anywhere in this world. What can we do? We'll wait for spring, of course. The onboard food will be enough for us if we sleep more. The water around us is loose and solid. Well, we can go off to the side and look for adventures on some body parts. We returned and reported this to the mathematician. To our surprise, he didn't frown, but looked indifferently at his feet. Something happened to him, and in general, he had deteriorated greatly recently. He had lost a very important feature, the charisma of a cruel and all-knowing boss. His adjutant had died, 2 of his servants had shown self-will, and it was not they who depended on him, but he on them. Day after day we were falling more and more into suspended animation, but our mathematician had fallen ill. We did not immediately understand this, because he did not complain, but then I noticed that he was not just muttering in his sleep, but delirious. His temperature had risen, and Vladimir Pavlovich first treated him with the prescribed medications from the train first aid kit, and then simply gave him food and drink. It was unclear what kind of illness it was, but it was certainly not one of those we knew. All this went on, until one of the quiet, frosty days, I had another dream. I immediately found myself in the recreation room. It was a room in a small house on the edge of the airfield, where the pilots whiled away the time between flights, or when flights were cancelled. Then, to the sound of the rain, they played billiards or stared at the TV. It was in this recreation room that I now stood alone. There was no one, only a newspaper that someone had thrown down on the billiard table. I really wanted to understand what they were writing there, and whether there was something important for me in the newspaper, instructions, a waypoint, but there was no text in the newspaper, only black rectangles and spaces, like it happened in old computer games when you zoomed in on a detail. You could only read the headlines, no less mysterious: prepare to raise the knife and close the wings, lower the knife, open the wings. There was no sense in this, but then I turned around. And when I turned around, I saw that the place where the flight schedule, orders and announcements were hanging had changed dramatically. Once, when my father brought me to the airfield, I was very scared. On the wall hung a photograph with a mourning stripe hung above the orders as a reminder of what people do here. I thought that someone had crashed, but no, it was one of the technicians who died, and his photo hung on the board along with the obituary. Now, in this place, I saw many photographs of different people, all the same format, but differently taken portraits. I wanted to understand where among them my father was, whether he was alive, after all, and whether it was possible to find him. I stood in front of the wall in the house, where the photographs of the dead pilots hung. I remembered that in that house at the airfield, this wall was not there, but here it was, and huge, long, half a village, half a regiment. Dozens of faces were looking at me, and I suspected that if I walked along the wall, I would turn the corner, where the corridor led to the meteorologists, and this columbarium of photographs would continue, would go on forever, and all the faces of dead pilots would be looking at me, faces on which there was no fear or horror of death, but only joy and happiness. Many of them were not in uniform. Some were in T-shirts and frivolous shirts. Some had their wives' hands on their shoulders, and she herself, cut off by the frame, was between hell and heaven. I peered at the photographs, and at the same time looked for my father, and did not want to find him. Finding his photograph meant confirming his death. If he was here, then he was not among the living. The house was deserted, and no one bothered me. Suddenly I saw a familiar face in the photo. It was my father's friend, a very successful man, in high rank. It was impossible not to recognize him. He had a head like a cucumber, elongated, of some shape that always struck me. Here he smiled, and his straight hair fell on his forehead. I remembered very well how he laughed, throwing back his head, and that was exactly how he remained in the photo. I had not thought about this man even once in 20 years, but here he was as I remembered him as a child. But my father was not among the pilots of this perished detachment. I opened my eyes and tried to calm down. As before, I was swimming in a cold sweat from tension and shaking. But this tension gradually subsided, and I calmed down. My father was not among the dead. That's the thing. He was not among the dead, and that was the main joy of all this time. I wiped myself with some kind of rag and opened the door of the locomotive to pee. I was staining the fresh snow yellow when suddenly I felt the presence of living people to the right of the locomotive. Immediately slamming the door shut, I shook Vladimir Pavlovich by the shoulder. We carefully leaned out of the window, and everything inside us grew cold and shrank. On the sleepers, about 10 paces in front of the locomotive, stood 3 people, but we did not immediately realize that they were people. True, they were dressed, and 2 were holding a pole on their shoulders, from which hung a long-legged pig, bloody head down, resembling a small deer, and on the neck of the 3rd, across his sunken chest, hung a huge bow, and behind his back was a quiver with arrows, too heavy and cumbersome for this elf. Here they are, the local mutants, I thought. Here they are. I had heard various stories about mutants and seen various freaks, but I had never seen anything like them. They looked like elves as they were depicted in books. I wonder how dangerous elves are. Do they rip off the skin of the living? Are they cannibals? The one with the bow bowed affectedly, but did not move. He only raised his hand with long, thin fingers. I expected with horror that there might have been 2 of them, but no, there were the usual 5 fingers on his hand, and I realized that I knew what this man was going to say. I knew for sure, from my dreams of the past, firmly ingrained in my consciousness. Do you want to eat? But Vladimir Pavlovich answered instead of me, breaking the template prepared in a past life. Of course. You won't shoot, the elf insisted on his line. No, I answered, smiling and supporting the game. No way. And we slowly, showing our hands, climbed down. We were invited to visit and, in fact, we had nothing to lose, and the weak-willed mathematician certainly did. We made a stretcher and walked through the shallow snow after our elves. There we found a sleigh with a harnessed horse. The horse was small in stature, but well-groomed. We laid the lifeless body of the mathematician on the sleigh, and the snow creaked under the runners. The sleigh moved slowly. Our guides sometimes walked alongside. Sometimes one of them sat down, changing places with each other so that the horse would not get tired. The path seemed endless, but at the most unexpected moment, we rode out to the edge of the forest, where there were about 10 large, strong huts, the same number of stone houses and some other buildings, apparently service buildings. But they stood strangely, as if in formation. We tumbled into some house after our hosts, tumbled in hastily, and walked ahead without undressing in what we were wearing. The stamp of order immediately struck my eyes. Lying on everything here was like in a fairy tale house. Neat, tidy, very clean, and painted glass bottles were placed everywhere, of which there were countless before the cataclysm. Here they were covered with some kind of homemade painting. We laid the mathematician on a wide bench. Vladimir Pavlovich said that he would look after him, and I went outside with the hosts. The horse was led into the stable, closely attached to the house. Judging by the configuration, there must have been a garage here in the old days. Thinking of helping somehow, I went to get water from the well. The gate creaked, and a bucket fell down, dropping lumps of snow. When I returned, the horse had already been unharnessed, and, when it had cooled down, they began to give it water that I had brought. Everything was in order here, and they even found blankets for us right away, although they turned out to be rather shabby. We fell asleep quickly, as if falling into an abyss, soundly and sweetly, as I slept as a child, returning from the yard, running around and tired. And I didn't dream of anything. In the morning, the hostess fed Vladimir Pavlovich and me some kind of grain porridge and began to listen to our stories. Remembering our unsuccessful experience with various interlocutors, we were cautious in our assessments of what we saw and fibbed just a little. Then I got into a conversation with the hostess. It turned out that the community had lived here for a long time, since the cataclysm. There was a summer cottage village for generally well-off people. Shortly before the cataclysm, they built their good houses here, but never had time to use them. None of the rich owners came here, and apparently will never come here. That's why several families of informals who fled from Tver settled here. The informals multiplied and multiplied, retained the habits of their hippie parents and a fiery love for some professor to whom they prayed, along with the Scandinavian gods. The professor, apparently from the Tver University, was for them something like Buddha, only he left his scripture. The names of these deities sounded rather funny to me, but they themselves had gotten used to them over the course of 20 years. Over 20 years you can believe in Stalin and his brother Kaganovich. I was already convinced of that. The name of the owner of our house was Larissa. Larissa Lara was her former name. Here, in the community, she was called by a complex name ending in L. She is a girl without age, I thought at once. In the dungeons, women age differently. Everything is different there. And here in front of me stood a woman of either 20 or 40, all because she was so active. Lara wore some strange outfit, similar to a robe, reaching to her ankles, only intercepted under the chest with some kind of runic belt. I was skeptical about these runes, but I did not argue with anything. If I restrained myself in front of the adherents of the night beauty, in front of believers in Stalin as in God, and did not argue with the Buddhists of the Day of Judgment, then the runic ligature and Celtic prayers certainly did not frighten me. The mathematician was put in a separate room, where he lay, staring blankly at the ceiling. I really didn't like the fact that he wasn't even delirious. I hadn't felt any self-interest in the mathematician for a long time, and of course I had forgotten about his offer of rewards and a change of residence. This offer now seemed like a joke to me. When I thought about it, and I thought about my life before the journey very rarely. And so the mathematician lay like a small bundle, deprived of weapons and separated from his ledger. Now I helped carry out his potty, and the landlady fed him. The mathematician grew a thin gray beard, and I remained as bald as I had been. Vladimir Pavlovich settled in the neighboring house, immediately taking on simple repairs there. The viscous and sleepy days dragged on. Winter had long since arrived. I learned the names of foreign gods and local idols, and soon stopped getting confused in names ending in horn and L. The faith here was intricate, but nothing was required of us, strangers, except not to laugh at the sacred things. Crackling. I rolled this word around on my tongue, because I remembered it from books, and only now I understood what it meant, because there were cracking frosts, and the trees next to the houses of the community were crackling, sounds were torn apart, and my ears were blocked. It was especially cold in the morning, when the entire space was occupied by frosty fog, in which ice floes seemed to hang in the air. The sun changed color, became dark red. Snow was everywhere, and everything angular became round. In the morning, the elves woke up late and did nothing for most of the day. 3 extra mouths did not seem to bother them much. I had just hinted that I could fix some device with wires for them when I was put in my place. Electricity was not recognized here, and they lived mainly by the sun. Winter was an idle time for the inhabitants of the settlement, with the exception of those who worked in the workshops, mainly on wood. I was not suitable for them and began to go to the blacksmith. The blacksmith, if he could be described in the same terms, was not an elf but rather a gnome, like me. He was a stocky man, old enough to be my father, and used to work at some Tver defense plant. He lived here from the very beginning, and his younger sister brought him to the community. At first, he scolded his sister for the eyeliner and strange tattoos she wore with him, and then became grateful to her for saving her. He was a real Russian man, ready to believe in almost anything, and if he saw affection, then in anything at all. If he had joined our Buddhists, he would have shaved his head and would have spoken with the same reverence about the reincarnations of a prince from a distant land. I needed a friend at that moment, because Vladimir Pavlovich had gone surprisingly deep into his personal life, as if he had finally found the purpose of his journey. It was logical. After all, everyone had their own goal and dream, but he was my selfless assistant. I didn't bother him and didn't loom before his eyes, so I was looking for another interlocutor. The mathematician looked like a vegetable and spoke incoherent phrases from time to time. And so I looked for conversations with the blacksmith to better understand how life was arranged here. I thought to become friends with him, but somehow it didn't work out. The blacksmith was far from me, thanks also for letting me into the forge. There I earned my bread, bringing him heavy blanks, blowing the bellows, and sometimes hammering on the orange-red and hot iron myself. Meanwhile, everything that surrounded me bore the stamp of an exotic faith. The lintel in my house was decorated with an elven pattern, once painstakingly made with a ballpoint pen and felt-tip pens. The inhabitants of the village were armed mainly with bows and long knives that looked like swords. There were very few guns, and mostly hunting shotguns, apparently left over from the disappeared owners of the houses. They explained to me that it was unprofitable and more expensive to go on a journey for ammunition, and it was much easier to load a homemade cartridge with homemade shot and your own gunpowder. And gunpowder, although better than electricity, was still unclean for the community. They did not like fire, and even a blacksmith for them was a person who came into contact with an evil force every day. And they apparently did not need firearms. They really were masters of bows, nothing to say, but they hunted, it seems, even more with the help of snares, bear pits, and ambushes. The hunters were afraid only of some totem hedgehog that lived in distant fields, beyond the swamps. This hedgehog from the plowed fields was painted in almost every house, where a bow and arrows hung on the wall as a reminder of the rules of hunting. I often went to get water, and the snow under my felt boots creaked like a musical instrument. At first, I confess, I was afraid of the snow. It hurt my eyes, but then I got used to its bright whiteness. Despite all their runes, the elven community regularly went to the Russian bathhouse, and I with them. The elves crowded into the bathhouse in groups, but without distinctions between genders. The customs here, as I immediately understood, were quite free. Families smoothly flowed into one another, and children ran from house to house under the supervision of adults, whether they were their parents or not. Once returning early and undressing in the entryway, I watched Larissa walking along a path trodden in the snow to the house. She was returning from the bathhouse, and you could see the steam rising from her face. When she entered the house, the windows in the room were immediately covered with loose frost from her wet hair. It smelled of oak leaves, birch, and some other sectarian herbs. We sat down at the table like Sherochka and Masherochka, hugged without words, and began to drink some kind of decoction. And before that, when she set the table, our hands came closer and remained one in the other for a second. A bowl or cup was placed on the table, and the touch ended, but I generally understood that this was the natural course of things and where things were heading. I did not experience any other feeling for her except tenderness. Several days passed, and the full moon arrived. It was a new experience. For the first time I looked at the moon without fear, and generally calmly looked at the night sky, not expecting an attack. I once asked these elves if they were afraid of mutated creatures, but they did not even understand what I was talking about. They were free, and so happy. The moon fascinated me, and in the silence of the forest I heard strange sounds. I told Lara that I heard strange sounds in the forest. I wondered if she could hear the cracking of branches and the movement of animals on the snow crust. She did not feel anything like that, and I began to think that I was hallucinating. But one day I decided to check the place from where I heard the sound. It was a kilometer from the village. I went there during the day and really found tracks in the snow. It was a small animal that I did not understand, and the tracks were small. Indeed, a normal person could not hear anything at such a distance. But who said that I was a normal person? No one said that. And now, on the night of the full moon, I heard too much. The crackling and rustling of that nature that lived without people before the cataclysm. Larissa came to me that night. She did it simply, without any hesitation, and her dress rustled, falling from her shoulders. Lara's body was almost purple in the moonlight, and in the white-lit room it was so bright that I could even make out the small moles fanned out across her back. All her tattoos on her shoulders, ankles, and back were visible, all in the form of cunning Celtic teeth and snakes. She slowly made her way under the blanket to me and set about her sweet business as if we had been living together for an eternity. For a moment her face merged with Katya's face, and it seemed to me that I was not lying on a wide bench in a warm wooden house, but pressing my friend against the red granite of the dynamo station. She moved like a huntress who catches an animal that is not very dangerous but has a temper. Like that huntress from the pictures, where the ancient goddess carries some animals that she has just caught. But now I was that animal, not very light and easy to tie up. But of course, I understood what was going on here. No illusions. But no remorse either. I will have to study my feelings further. Warming myself later under the blanket and looking at the ceiling, I understood that all this was bad. Nothing will work out for me with either one. And don't expect anything good for yourself, I thought. No need to look for someone to blame. It's not even known how much time I have left to live. And it's not about the fact that if it's not long, then I can behave sloppily. Or if I live long enough, then I need to behave correctly. Time puts everything in its place, and time is fast here. And I again remembered the thought that if you wait too long, then you will be carried past your enemy's house. I tried to understand my location, and in general, what and how I was doing, what was wrong with me. There was no need to dig into myself, especially when a woman was sleeping on my chest, because when she was sleeping, it was very difficult to jump up, driving away the horror of loneliness. But loneliness was there. It wouldn't let go, and loving two women was bad, and it wouldn't lead me to anything good. I didn't really understand what love was. All concepts had shifted, and what was described in books before the cataclysm was completely unnatural in our days. The relationships between people in books were completely artificial and full of conventions. These conventions had disappeared, and while I was still living at Sokol Station, which now seemed like a dream of the past, I understood that books didn't give an answer to how and what to feel in certain situations. Books didn't explain anything. It was an experience that wasn't inherited. What could a story about a man younger than me, who drank sweetly, slept soundly, yearned, and then saw a huge tree in the forest, and immediately fell in love with everyone, give me? I was also stunned when I saw the forest after a 20-year break, much cooler than the hero of long-rotted books. And what of it? And I tried to dive deep into a dream where my father would come and explain everything to me. I expected that my yearning would dissipate in this dream, like the fog over the runway, which disappears as soon as the sun begins to warm. But I was not given dreams, and my father, who I had not found, did not come to me. The next night, everything repeated itself, but the power was already on the side of the dwarves. The war was evil, repetitive, mechanical, but the supreme power and success were mine. Balin entered the fertile land with a blunt wedge, cut through the Shire and Eriador, advanced as an advance guard to Rohan. I conquered this land slowly, but without retreating a single step, closely observing all the enemy's movements. The time has come when despair retreats, and nothing can stop you. What's more, not our wheezing and heavy breathing, but the clanking of war chariots resounded throughout the entire sublunary and full moon world. All the evil of the world fell into the abyss, the underground karst, into abandoned tunnels and mine workings, and here the kingdom of justice was being restored. The runic ligature, written on the walls crookedly but diligently, was beautiful, but doubled in the eyes, covered in sweat. And then came the balancing act. The defeated Rohan was breathing nearby. I saw myself from the outside, a bald, funny dwarf who burst into the palace, played a prank, and fell among silks and pillows. And, as expected, I nudged Rohan, who was snorting nearby, in the side. But his sleep was deep, unlike mine. Soon I discovered that Vladimir Pavlovich was also settled. We began to see each other less, and I started this transformation. I went to pick up Vladimir Pavlovich to go to the smithy together, but I immediately realized that my friend would not go to any smithy. He was having lunch in the neighboring house, having borscht with moonshine. A fit woman was sitting at the table with him, strong as a springy and sturdy butter dish. Judging by the relaxed way Vladimir Pavlovich looked to the side, he worked tirelessly at night, in general tirelessly. The days were beautiful and the nights even more beautiful. Although during the day I enjoyed the sight of the snow, its taste and other properties. The snow was different everywhere. Hard and icy at the foot of the walls, light and loose on the branches of the fir trees, prickly when I dipped my hand into a snowdrift, and fluffy when it fell from the sky. However, I began to think more and more often about what I was doing here. I could have stayed here forever. I would have forged myself a short sword, and if a mutant boar came to the village, the elves would have called me. I would have left the house sleepy and rumpled, but with one blow I would have cut the boar in two. The mutant would have disappeared in a cloud of pink steam, and I would have enjoyed the delight and gratitude of the elves. But this was nonsense, and not because I would not have learned to fight the boars. This is all unrealistic, because in a year or two I would have become so sad that I could have hanged myself. It is clear that I cannot live here. I cannot live on this island of peace, covered with snow like a fur coat. I cannot hide from myself. I have left Pavlov's dogs, but I will not leave myself. And she guessed that her unspoken dream of a family-inhabited home would not come true, and that the hour of our separation was near. In general, we understood that we would definitely lose each other. At night I began to hear the howling of wolves. However, I thought that it was wolves howling. You can't understand who was howling in the distance. Maybe they were some kind of monsters, new dragons. The hedgehog from the fields who walks along a moonlit path in the middle of a snowy field with a pack of dogs and looks for a lost person. No one heard it, and only I was afraid of this night howl. Lying under the blanket next to Larissa, I then took her by the river and squeezed her wrist. It was very good, it was beautiful and desperately sad, because I understood that sooner or later I would leave this village of costumed elves. After some of our conversations about trifles, She looked upset. I understood where this melancholy uneasiness was coming from. The snow lay deep that winter. All the buildings seemed lower than they were. The elves had trodden deep paths, like trenches, to all the houses and other places. When I went to relieve myself, I often ran into some elven maiden, and to pass each other, we pressed our backs against the snow walls and our chests against each other. Huge caps of snow hung from all the canopies above the doors. I got the hang of chopping wood and succeeded in it. The logs were heavy and covered with snow. They looked like enemies in line for destruction. At first I was not very precise with the axe and spent much more time chopping than I thought. My back ached terribly, but I promised myself that I would continue the next day. But the next day I lay prone, afraid to move. Then I went back to chopping wood and finished the job. I chopped it for what seemed like an eternity, day after day. I provided the community with wood, it seemed to me, not only until the end of this winter, but also for the next year. It was a bit pointless, because I noticed that there were practically no wood piles here. The locals stocked up on wood for a day or two, but so be it. Well, it was not for me to criticize the local habits. Winter had long since turned to frost, but now it had softened. The last snow was about to fall from the dark sky, covered with low clouds. I went to the blacksmith, shivering from the cold, and thought that the elves loved me, but I was a stranger among them, and would always remain a stranger here. I talked to Larissa. She also understood that I was a stranger, but it was obvious that she was tossing and turning, because everything here seemed to be arranged freely, but at the same time, everything was subject to strict, unbreakable rules. We are kept here for insemination, Vladimir Pavlovich said cheerfully, for reproduction. The role of inseminator, apparently, did not seem humiliating to him, and really, what's wrong with that? An anxious languor and a premonition of change began to spread in the air. One day I stopped with some kind of burden in the middle of a path, trampled in the snow, and suddenly I was horrified. Although it was a clear spring day and quite light, I had the feeling that I was standing at night in a thick, dense, scary forest. I felt so gloomy in my soul that I wanted to hit my head on the edge of the well. Something stopped inside me. The connection of times was broken, as the head of the Sokol station would say. It was time for me to die, but I had done nothing in my life, and that's why I felt worse. Because I understood that, on the other hand, I was now clothed and shod, well fed, and there was a woman next to me. Ah, the abyss. It was that psychosis, the melancholy described in books. Once, when we were lying, hugging, Larissa asked me at the most unexpected moment, "You're leaving soon, aren't you?" I should have laughed it off. I had 100 humorous answers prepared, but she waylaid me and caught me off guard. And besides, you can't run away from such questions forever. "I'll leave." "Sasha," she asked, "why are you going? It's a lost cause." "I don't want to die at all, but the circumstances are such. If I had my way, I would live in the forest. But to be honest, I should have said that I would have died of melancholy in the forest, even with her. Even, and I remembered Katya completely inopportunely. Lara was silent, thinking over my last words, and then laid her head on my lap. "You're terribly stubborn," she said. "A real warrior created for glory. Oh my, you've seen warriors, haven't you? Real warriors are cruel and merciless. They smell of blood and dirt. There's no glory now, there's survival. I want to go with you," Lara said hopefully. "I'll fight with you. You don't know how strong I am." But I didn't want to give her hope, either. "You see, in your fairy tales, I'm not a knight with a sword, but a dwarf. We dwarves live in dungeons. Our life is disgusting, and we smell of sooty stone and old urine, and we have rats instead of pets, that's what. And if I follow your tales, I must say that you must stay with your people." I did not tell her that I myself do not understand why I do not stay with her. Why am I in a hurry from the security here to the darkness of the dungeon, which I continue to consider my home? Well, and about the woman who lives there in the darkness, I did not say, but it seems that she guessed, although she did not ask anything. Or maybe that is precisely why she did not ask, because she guessed. Because of you, I looked after your comrade, and now he is back on his feet. And no one owes me anything, so I owe everyone. You can't impose someone else's life on anyone, I answered, but thought about it. I could not understand what was speaking in me, a craving for home, where there was another woman, or was it just common sense? I understood what the subway was, which, by the way, I still had to get to. "So it will always be like this?" Larissa asked bitterly. "A man goes off to war, and a woman stays to take care of the property and wait, preparing for the meeting." "It may be that there is no one to meet," I answered. But Vladimir Pavlovich and I were getting ready, little by little. Nothing had been done yet, but sitting on the porch and listening to the dripping, we understood that we would not stay here for long, and the mathematician clearly wanted to go. But this was no longer the bold, charismatic mathematician I remembered, but his shadow. And he looked at me, somehow, pleadingly. Imperceptibly, we changed places. No, he did not become more frank or kinder, but simply lost his will. Now the servants became more important than the master, but there was no need for us to take out our former fear on him. No need. We had changed a long time ago, and it seemed as if each had taken something from the other. The mathematician had taken away some of my uncertainty and sentimentality. Vladimir Pavlovich had been imbued with my pathos, and I had learned imperturbability from him. What I had inherited from the mathematician I could not yet understand, but I had inherited something, had I not? One day I remembered that I had long wanted to ask him about something, but somehow forgot. Now it was completely out of place, but required verbal completion. "Tell me," I began, "do you remember the bald girl?" The mathematician looked at me with faded eyes, and it was clear that he did not remember anything. "The bald girl. Your Mirzo shaved her, and then you brought her to the Technological Institute. What's the trick? The map on her head?" The mathematician chewed his lips, remembering, and I was once again convinced that people meant little more to him than specific pieces on a chessboard. That is, they meant something, but only within the framework of a single game. "I understand," the mathematician finally answered. "It's a stupid story. Father wanted to save her, so he gave her this tattoo of the tunnel junction. He thought that this would help them find her if something happened. It would be an incentive to look for the girl. They did look for her for several years, and then the problem solved itself. Everything changed, even the tunnels are different, and the codes changed almost immediately. I copied the drawing just in case, but it was just for the record, in case we don't deliver her. I wouldn't cut off her head as proof, and insects are unhygienic." "You shaved her because of insects? No secret ritual?" I believed that explanation right away. If it were hygienic, he would have cut off anyone's head, not because he hated them, but for reasons of expediency of his chess moves. Old man Usiskin is an old friend of her father, since before her father was taken to the government, and her father was our boss in Moscow, and he was still looking for her. That was the reason he lived, because he had this goal, But he didn't need a daughter by his side. He needed the illusion that she was safe and well-fed. Would you, Alexander, want such a daughter? No, and no one would. And so I was sent to find her and place her in a warm place. I thought it was high time to ask him what profit he was actually returning with. But I didn't ask. I felt that the time for frankness was over for him. Finally, Vladimir Pavlovich and I got ready, and having said goodbye to everyone, left the house. The mathematician was still weak and lingered in his room. It seemed to me that I could hear his heavy, intermittent breathing through the wall. But then he came out, squinting at the sun. We had already taken a few steps when I heard a light cry behind me. The mathematician slipped on the porch, jumped up in the air strangely, hit the next step with his heels, and hit the back of his head on the corner of a thick board with all his might. We turned around, but the mathematician did not get up. Then I went to him, slowly at first, then faster. The mathematician was lying on the steps and looking at the sky. His eyelids slowly crawled down, and finally his eyes closed, like an old rooster closing his eyes. Even from the side you could see how unnaturally his head was twisted to the side. Yes, the mathematician was dead. I could not come to my senses from this absurdity. The mathematician could have died several times. He could have been grabbed by the conductor or eaten by the pseudo-chef. He could have been shot in countless showdowns inside the St. Petersburg metro and on the surface. But for it to happen like this, for a smart and evil man, far from enemies and real dangers, to turn into a dead body with a broken head in a second, I somehow did not expect that. It resembled mockery and humiliation, and from the higher powers of nature. That is, in this transformation into a dead body, it was not a defeat or failure, but a punishment. We buried the mathematician on a hill, and did not leave anything on the grave, not even a pebble. All this was useless. No one knew where he was lying, and no one would ask us about him. Vladimir Pavlovich, taking advantage of the opportunity, got drunk again at the funeral, so we set off on our journey only 2 days later. We walked to the fence, and then trotted along the road leading to our train. It was spring all around us. The snow was melting. The road was 2 streams, and so we decided to walk straight across the field, but along the road. And spring was shining all around. I remembered that I had never seen spring in my new life. Only now it had become a habit that before taking off the respirator and taking a breath of intoxicating air into my lungs, I checked the dosimeter readings. The days were transparent, like glass. The earth was wet, and the air was dry. And clouds were slowly floating in the sky. They were floating as if alive. Some moved away or disappeared, but new ones came to replace them. And I thought that years had passed, and nothing had changed. Only this world was almost devoid of people, and there were somehow few birds left in it. As if in response to my thoughts, a flock of some unknown birds flew in the sky in front of us, high, high. And only a few seconds later I heard the echo of their strange guttural cry. The earth thawed and smelled unbearably beautiful and disturbing, as if the smell of childhood and happiness had returned, and I thought that it would be easy to die under such a sky. There would be something to die for.